creative and explains a lot. If we take a look at a very famous pasuk in the prophet Amos, the prophet Amos says the following: Hine yamim ba'im, nu Hashem Elokim, behold, days are coming, says the Lord God, v'hishlachti ra'av ba'aretz, I'm going to send a famine in the land. Lo ra'av alechem, not a famine for bread, v'lo tzama l'mayim, and not a thirst for water, ki'im lishmoa et divrei Hashem, but rather to hear the words of the Lord. Interestingly enough, this pasuk is popularly understood as describing a kind of messianic vision when people are going to be thirsting not for delicious meals at fancy restaurants, but they're going to be thirsting for the word of the Lord in a very positive sense, that people are going to be developed spiritually to the extent that that's what they thirst for. But if you take a look at the pasuk in context, it's exactly the opposite. That he's describing a time of destruction and exile, when in fact that people are going to be thirsty for the word of the Lord in the sense that there will be no word of the Lord anymore. Right? If you take a look at the next pasuk, by the way, for those, this is not in your source sheet, but if you want to look it up later, it's in Amos Perek Chet, in the 8th chapter of Amos. So the verse goes on, skipping a few words, and it says, Yishotetu levakesh et dvar Hashem. They shall wander seeking out the word of the Lord, v'lo yimtzau, and they will not find it, because the word of the Lord, meaning the phenomenon of prophecy, will cease to exist. Vayomahu titalafna betulot hayafot. In those days, the virgins will faint, v'bachurim batsama, and also the young lads will faint, but sama out of thirst, right? This is not describing a messianic vision of what's going to be great in the future as people search for spiritual nourishment. On the contrary, it's describing a state of khurban, of destruction, in which people will seek out the prophetic message, but it won't be there. Why? Because prophecy will have ceased. So this is the first common approach of understanding what happened to prophecy, that without explaining exactly the mechanism, as a function of the prevalence of severe sin, the sins that brought about the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, another consequence of that was the loss of prophecy. The Rambam gives a very different explanation, a famous and interesting explanation, which says the following: that the prophetic capability, which the Rambam views as a natural talent that can be consciously developed, that we find already described in Tanakh, the idea of schools of prophets. You could go get a PhD in prophecy from Yeshivat Har Etzion. And this would be as a function of great piety and great knowledge of the Lord. And if one does that, one becomes a prophet. And he goes so far as to say that it would be a miracle. Hashem can intervene and stop you from being a prophet. But that would be divine intervention in what otherwise would be the natural achievement of prophecy, according to the Rambam. But the Rambam adds the following caveat, and that is the following: that in order to have this capability, one cannot be in a state of depression. One cannot be in a state of depression. That a state of depression will harm the natural capability of being a prophet. And therefore, the Jewish people, as a result of destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and all of the other tragedies which are associated with that, slavery, death, etc., that the Jewish people are in a collective state of depression. And that collective state of depression does not allow any longer for prophecy to exist. By the way, there's a very similar idea of why we don't do Birkat Kohanim on a regular basis outside of Israel. Right? We only do it on the holidays. Why is that? Because Birkat Kohanim, the blessings of the Kohanim, also requires that the Kohanim be in a state of joy in order to sort of channel this divine blessing, almost perhaps as a kind of paradigm of channeling divine voice like prophecy. It has to be in a state of simcha. And since the Jewish people are assumed to be in this collective state of depression as a result of destruction and exile, so we only say the Birkat Kohanim on the days in which there's something added to those days which increases the level of joy that we can at least temporarily emerge from our state of depression, like on the regalim, like on the festivals. So that's the reason why in most communities outside of Israel that Birkat Kohanim is only said in the festivals. Of course, here in Israel, we're always happy when you say Birkat Kohanim every day. A third approach, and like I said, there are many approaches. I'm just giving you three just to give you a taste of the range of approaches, is stated in the Sefer Ikarim, which is one of the most classic philosophical texts from the Middle Ages, Rabbi Yosef Albo. And he says the following, and it's a little bit of a mystical explanation. He says that prophecy can only exist if you have certain tools, which are physical tools, which exist in order to be able to act as vessels for the divine presence to reside in this world. And as a result of these vessels existing that can kind of capture the Shekhinah, the divine presence, that allows for the capability of prophecy. Like, it's as if where the prophets are plugging into this high voltage generator, which contains the divine presence in order to be able to prophesy. And what are those items which contain the divine presence and the prophets plug into? The Aron Habrit, the Ark of the Covenant, Valuchot, right? The tablets of the 10 utterances, which are contained in the Aron Habrit, right? That the Shekhinah dwells there. And in the absence of the Aron Habrit, which we no longer have after the destruction of the first temple, so the Shekhinah does not dwell in the same way it was able to before, and therefore prophets have nothing to plug into. The grid is down, the prophetic grid is down, and therefore they're not able to be able to plug into that. Okay. Now, we're going to contrast that approach with the approach of the Rambam. Of Rav Kook. That's what we'll spend the rest of this shiur doing. But I want to tell you right off the bat what we're not going to discuss, important aspects of this general issue. And so don't bother asking me any questions about it. We're not going to discuss, well, what is prophecy? At least we're not going to discuss that in any thorough fashion. We're not going to be discussing in any thorough fashion, how does one become a prophet? And we're not going to be discussing in any thorough fashion, are there any prophets nowadays? So those are important related issues. And if we were discussing the general phenomenon of prophecy, we would obviously want to discuss those issues. But I really want to discuss specifically Rav Kook's explanation of the cessation of prophecy. And therefore, those bigger issues will have to wait for another time. Okay. Now, if you'll take out your source sheets, which I hope everybody was able to access through the link that was sent out. You can access it now. Let's take a look at a passage from Orot HaKodesh, written by the Nazir, collecting from much material of Rav Kook in order to give a kind of encyclopedic and systematic presentation of Rav Kook's worldview. That was the function of this text, Orot HaKodesh. Rav Kook says the following: those who possess great perception, their faculty of imagination is very great and lofty. It, faculty of imagination, is bound up with the most general universal visions that exist. So Rav Kook is suggesting that we have this faculty, koach hamidameh, the faculty of imagination. And people should mute themselves, by the way. Okay, make sure you're muted. And that faculty of imagination allows people to envision and express very lofty and big ideas. Rav Kook goes on. There acts within them people who have a very well-developed koach hamidameh, the faculty of imagination. The faculty of imagination, in accordance with their greatness of spiritual strength and purity, to envision supernal and lofty visions such that the light of supernal truth is revealed through them. So let's just pause there for a moment. This concept of the faculty of imagination, Rav Kook addresses at great length. It's one of the central themes in Rav Kook's thinking. And Rav Kook is alluding here to a very important idea. And that is the faculty of imagination, on the one hand, allows for the ability to have grand visions and to express those visions in very lyrical and poetic language. We'll see that in just a moment, how he discusses that. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword. The fact that Rav Kook says that it's in accordance with the greatness of spiritual strength and purity, he's alluding to the fact that the faculty of imagination can also be the source of the greatest distress and sin. Because if one thinks about it, what leads people to sin? The faculty of imagination. If we take a look at what goes on in terms of secular culture nowadays, which is built upon the faculty of imagination, the arts, the whole entertainment culture is built upon the faculty of imagination, creativity, creative people. And yet, when we take a look, especially at contemporary culture, using the faculty of imagination in very brilliant ways, it's often used to tap into the most base instincts of human beings. When we're able to somehow view the world in a way, which we often do, which has no relationship to reality, we have these distorted lenses in which we view the world in a way which has nothing to do with the way the world really is. And that shrirut halev, that imagination draws us towards sin. That's the faculty of imagination. So the faculty of imagination has this incredibly noble function on the condition that we have cultivated spiritual strength and purity, that it's rooted in a moral, ethical, and spiritually refined infrastructure. Rav Kook goes on. With revelations that no rational intellect can reach. Rav Kook now is talking about another faculty, which is going to compare and contrast. We had the faculty of imagination on the one hand, and rational intellect on the other hand, the faculty of analytical intelligence. And he claims that the insights that one can achieve through the faculty of imagination far outreach those that analytical thinking can achieve. Now that's an amazing idea. Let's discuss that for a moment. Intellectual analysis, Rav Kook understands as dealing with the world of the material, dealing with the world of the finite. A finite tool cannot access the infinite. After all, the world is not just nature. It's not just material. The world is permeated with the divine presence, with an aspect of reality which is infinite, just as God is infinite. And to be able to have insight into that world requires a tool which is able to tap into the infinite. Intellect is finite, and it cannot access the infinite. The founder of Chabad Hasidut, the Baal Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, uses a slightly different image, which may be helpful in understanding this idea. And he says, and I'm putting this in my own words, imagine someone saying the following: that light is so bright, I can't smell it. That light is so bright, I can't smell it. That sentence makes no sense whatsoever, because the sense of smell is irrelevant to access something visual. In the same way, the Baal Tanya explains that as important as intellect is, it is not an appropriate tool to access ultimately the infinite, the Ein Sof. And that's what Rav Kook is alluding to here when he says that the faculty of imagination, which somehow transcends the finite, circumscribed capability of the reach of intellect, the faculty of imagination can access the infinite. Just want to share with you a wonderful example of this that I remember when I was just a freshman in college. And at that point, I still had this idea of becoming a physician, and I was taking all these pre-med courses. Then I decided to go for the money and become a rabbi. So I remember in chemistry class, the professor telling us about the German scientist for the 19th century who discovered the structure of benzene. So the structure of benzene is discovered by this scientist in the 19th century. It's a string of carbon atoms that are bound together with alternating single and double bonds. Okay, it's a string of these carbon atoms in a circle, a ring. 6 carbon atoms connected together. How did he discover it? Now, he was a scientist, but he said he actually only was able to discover it when he was daydreaming. And he had a dream. It was not on the chalkboard working out mathematical equations. He had a vision. He dreamt of a snake biting its tail. A snake biting its tail. And then he came out of this daydream and he realized, wow. And he came upon the structure of benzene, of this ring of carbon atoms, that he was able to make that leap based upon the faculty of imagination. Of course, he then went back and translated everything into chemical and scientific terms after he had that kind of raw insight, which he was only able to achieve through the faculty of imagination. Now, if you turn the page in your source sheet, this contrast between, on the one hand, the faculty of imagination and the faculty of intellect may have reminded you of a certain dichotomy that we're very familiar with. People are probably familiar with this idea of left-brained people and right-brained people. So according to neuroscience, that in general, the left side of the brain tends to be associated with logical analysis, like you see this chart over here. Mathematical thinking, analytical thinking, whereas the right side of the brain, generally speaking, is associated with expression, emotional intelligence, imagination, right? So it is interesting that Rav Kook's describing these two different faculties that we have. On the one hand, the faculty of imagination, and on the other hand, the analytical, intellectual faculty is associated with how neuroscience understands this left brain versus right brain thinking. And interestingly enough, just as another example of the dynamic between these two faculties, I have here a quote from Albert Einstein in which he says, very famous quote. Interestingly, Einstein was obviously a great scientist. At the same time, he was apparently a very good violinist. So he had a kind of well-developed artistic faculty of imagination, right? That's where that side of the brain, of the right side of the brain, develops people who become great violinists, but also obviously was a great scientist, the left side of the brain. And he says the following: I am enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. And I think when he says knowledge, he doesn't mean just a finite set of knowledge, but intellect. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination encircles the world. So Albert Einstein also recognizing this kind of a dichotomy between, on the one hand, the faculty of imagination, on the other hand, the intellectual faculty, and the notion, as Rav Kook described, that the faculty of imagination allows us to access realms of the infinite, whereas the analytical faculty is circumscribed within the kind of material world as is appropriate for a kind of mathematical way of thinking. Fine. With that introduction now, we're going to examine a very famous passage in the Talmud. And that passage in the Talmud is going to be the frame for Rav Kook's analysis of what happened to prophecy. You may have wondered, what happened to our topic? Well, you'll see. We need to discuss this notion of the dichotomy between right brain, left brain, or faculty of imagination versus analytical thinking, the intellectual faculty, in order to understand what Rav Kook is going to say about what happened to prophecy. Let's take a look at this passage in the Talmud. Amar Ameimar, v'chacham adif min navi, that the sage is greater than a prophet. A sage is greater than the prophet. And Ameimar quotes a verse from Tehillim, from Psalms, as a kind of reflection of this idea, v'navi levav chokhmah, that a prophet has the heart of wisdom. This is the way Ameimar understands that verse. A prophet has a heart of wisdom, and the Talmud then goes on to explain why that verse reflects this idea of the supremacy of the sage versus that of a prophet. By the way, when we say sage, we mean in the Talmudic sense of the word sage, right? The sages of the Talmud, those people who think halachically, Talmudic thinking, like mathematical thinking. Minit lebami, when you're comparing two things, what is dependent upon the other? The smaller thing is dependent upon the greater thing. So explains Ameimar. So when it says v'navi levav chokhmah, that a prophet has a heart of wisdom, we're saying that a prophet has a faculty that can be compared to something greater. That is wisdom, meaning, and Rav Kook certainly understands this in the sense of chokhmah, meaning analytical thinking, that done by a sage, chacham. As Ameimar says, chacham adif min navi, right? That there's something superior about what a Talmudic sage does, a rabbi does, when he thinks Talmudically, halachically, versus that of a prophet. I just want to point out as a footnote here, it can be sometimes maddening to try to understand exactly how a verse is used as a so-called proof text. It usually, or very often, is not a very productive thing to engage in. So I want to point out his observation that the verse doesn't even mean that at all, what Ameimar is saying. When it says, v'navi levav chokhmah, that a prophet has a heart of wisdom, the verse actually means in context, the word navi doesn't mean a prophet at all. It means we shall bring. Navi, lahavi, to bring, not from the word navi, prophet at all. So don't lose sleep over that. When I was in yeshiva, my Rabbi always said, forget about the proof text, just look at the statement, right? The statement is, chacham adif min navi, that a Talmudic thinking rabbi, sage, Talmudic sage, is superior to that of a prophet. Question is, why? So everybody ready to dive in? So put on your seatbelts, and we're going to take a look at Rav Kook's very famous analysis now. Poets and rhetoricians. That is, let's use concepts that we were developing before. Right-brained people. People who are artistic. People who are able to express themselves through writing and through oration. That's the reference to rhetoric there. People who can give moving speeches that move the heart. Are characteristically adept at describing the general splendor of life. A poet, a great speaker, has the ability to describe in big terms, in general terms, the great beauty of existence. They can describe the great beauty of Yosemite Valley or Gush Etzion. All its especially beautiful aspects, those which encompass mighty streams and abundant vitality. But people who have that same talent of imagination, the ability to express themselves in writing or in speaking in such a beautiful, poetic way, they're also able to use that same faculty, not just to describe the beauty of existence, but also the distortions of existence. They're able to expose the general ugliness of life's perversions and to protest vigorously against them. So those writers can also become great social critics who are able to use the talents of the imaginative faculty to be able to express in ways that move the heart, biting critique of society. Then Rav Kook goes on. But there's a big limit to this talent, the faculty of imagination. What is it? Because in contrast to the poet's ability to describe the big ideas, the general splendor of life, term Rav Kook used, however, penetrating the details, okay, that's a very important theme. Also, motif one finds throughout Rav Kook's writings, the contrast between details and generalities. The poet, the great speaker, focuses on generalities, but penetrating the details of particular causes, determining how to set life on a solid foundation, how to create a society which in fact functions properly, preserving it from even the slightest perversion, how to create a society which is law-abiding, orderly, that functions, which would eventually cause it to run aground and be ruined, right? The ability to see the details of how things can go wrong if not managed properly in terms of details. All these are not within the competence of enthused and vigorous imaginative power. The poet is not able to think in those detailed terms, and he's not able to express and give guidance how, as we say, the devil is in the details, but the opposite too. Salvation is in the details. We don't want to have people who are running our cities who are poets, unless you're just looking for inspiration. But if you want to have clean streets, you want to have the garbage collected, and you want to have a functioning life, you need to have somebody, not a poet, who thinks not in generalities, but in details. Rather, they lie, Rav Kook goes on, within the province of analytical wisdom, chokhmah. That's detailed thinking. Here begins the work of, and now he just talks about people in general society who are thinking in left brain thinking. Physicians, economists, engineers, judges, and all those engaged in practical wisdom. Now, right now, Rav Kook is talking about left brain, right brain, that dichotomy in terms of how it functions generally in society. He's not talking about necessarily right now how it functions in religious terms. In the next paragraph, Rav Kook is going to take this theme and now project it onto a spiritual realm. As he says, on a higher plane, prophecy beheld the perverse stream of idolatry in Israel and powerfully protested against it. Now we just saw an amazing thing. Rav Kook is associating prophecy with poets, great speakers, meaning right-brained faculty. The koach hamidameh, the faculty of imagination. A prophet is somebody who has an extremely well-developed koach hamidameh, the faculty of imagination. And that faculty of imagination allows for the prophet to see the great faults of society, idolatry, and empowers the prophet to protest against these perversions that permeate society, these great general perversions. Now he looks at the same thing, but in a positive sense. Prophecy also beheld the blissful splendor of the one Lord, Israel's God, portraying its full beauty and magnificence. So prophecy both acts as a social critic, and prophecy acts as a description of the splendor of the spiritual life, all in grand, poetic, moving language. It beheld, too, the corruption of various forms of moral lawlessness, the oppression of the poor, the exploitation of the needy, murder, idolatry, violence, and theft. That's all in the realm of prophecy. These great, sweeping pronouncements, both about corruption and about the beauty of the world. Prophecy became infused with the Spirit of God to deliver and provide remedy through lofty, holy oration. How did the prophets function? Their prophecy is rooted in the power of imagination, and their response to their perceptions of these great distortions of society was expressed through lyrical poetry to move the hearts, motivate us through the power of the word, which reaches the heart, which speaks to the power of the imagination of those listening. That's how prophecy works. But now, just like we saw before, that prophecy has certain limitations, it has certain advantages. And on the other hand, the power of intellect has certain limitations, certain advantages. Rav Kook is now going to describe the limitation of the prophetic power, of the power of imagination. Hidden from the prophetic visionary eye are the thin threads. It's going to be a hard sentence. I'll explain it when we're done reading it. That combine into the cords of sin. The fine capillaries that pool into the large receptacles of blood. Let's just pause there for a moment. Rav Kook is alluding to a passage in Masechet Sukkah in which the Talmud says that the Yetzer Hara, our base inclinations, are similar to the threads of a spider web, very delicate at the beginning. Ulavasof, but ultimately those fine, subtle threads, like of a spider web, they become like a cable which is hitched a wagon to pull a wagon. So the Talmud suggests there that this is the great challenge of life, that we allow ourselves to do things which aren't proper because they seem not so bad. Little things like spiderweb. But that which begins in that way ends up being, even though it seems small and subtle, it ends up being a huge sin that ultimately results in the downfall of our lives individually and collectively. So that's what he means, that the prophet doesn't see how the devil in the details in a negative sense, how small details can morph into huge destructive forces in our lives and the lives of society. Now he says it in more plain language. How the workings of all the practical mitzvot, with the meticulous precision of their detailed laws, when these are observed and studied, become familiar and beloved, how their concealed inner bliss of law will eventually be revealed, and the divine pure life stream will dispel with its might the darkness of idolatry, so that it may never rise again. Rav Kook is saying an amazing thing. The power of halacha, detailed thinking, left brain, is that in fact detailed, precise guidance on how to live a proper life, the system of halacha. The system of halacha is analytical, is details. Only that approach has the capability of actually making transformation. Poets the big picture. Because it's so abstract, it's inspiring. But ultimately, that's not how we change. We change as individuals in society through detailed prescription of proper behavior, of which shoe to tie first, of what's considered to be interest in taking a loan, of what's considered to be lashon hara, and all of the myriad, thousands and thousands of details of the halachic life. The prophet just doesn't understand it, doesn't see it, doesn't recognize it. Let's read on. And by the way, before we read on, he says, and it's only, in fact, where he says that it's that approach, the approach of analysis, of intellect, of halakha, the left brain approach, is that which dispels the darkness of idolatries that may never rise again. Rav Kook saying an amazing thing. Prophecy failed. The lyrical inspiration of prophecy was not successful in destroying idolatry. Only the system of halakha, in its thousands of details which regulate every moment of our daily lives, only that was ultimately successful in destroying idolatry. And Rav Kook goes on now to describe the limitations of prophecy, how the gradual neglect that devalues actions, right? When you think in big terms, like the imaginative faculty, you devalue the details of day-to-day action. And there are many branches and details that neglect initiates a process of ruin. When you only think big, universal peace and love, but you hate your neighbor, right? That ultimately destroys the vessels that can receive the exalted spirit, whereby the inclination of the human heart, that misleading imagination, magnificently adorned but filled with poisonous dust, right? Faculty of imagination could become the worst enemy. It can produce sublime prophecy, and it can lead us to horrible ruin by blinding us to the truth of what is proper and correct when we perceive reality in a way which has nothing to do with reality. Magnificently adorned, the faculty of imagination, but filled with poisonous dust inside, which can grow in and of itself. None of this appreciation of detailed halachic system was accessible to prophecy. That is, to prophecy through a dim glass. The Talmud points out that the prophets, other than Moshe, had a nature of prophecy which was like a dim glass, whereas Moshe's prophecy was a clear glass, something very different. And now Rav Kook is going to explain Mosaic prophecy. What's different about that? However, it is accessible, meaning that one can appreciate the system of halakha, analytical, logical thinking, halachic thinking, the Talmudic endeavor, even if you're a prophet, but only if you're a prophet on the level of Moshe. As the Talmud says, clear glass, aspaklaria ha'me'ira, delivered mouth to mouth, and which alone could perceive both the power of generalities, the faculty of imagination, the prophetic endeavor, the poetic endeavor, and at the same time, the precision of particulars. Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moshe, those words coming from his mouth have passages which are of the most sublime poetry and of gory details. Parshat Mishpatim sounds like Shulchan Aruch. Parshat Hazinu is the glory of poetic and lyrical, broad expressions which move the heart. Both coming from Moshe. Moshe is the integration of the Chacham and the Navi. But only Moshe was able to integrate both of those approaches. But Rav Kook goes on, alas, there has never been another like him. As it is written, never again did there arise another prophet like Moshe, whom the Lord singled out. face to face. So let's just review a little bit where we are right now. Rav Kook has just explained, and we'll go on a little bit later to address it again, that prophecy ultimately failed. It was ultimately not able to create a functioning, law-abiding society. Why? Because prophecy saw the big picture, the poetic flourish, whether describing positive aspects or negative aspects of life. But without the detailed prescription of law, we ultimately don't change. And the transformation of an idolatrous, distorted, perverse society to a law-abiding, orderly society could only be accomplished by the Chachamim, by those who understood and were able to think and express on the level of details. Law. It was thus necessary, go back to the text, to assign to the prophets the task of generalities and to the Chachamim the task of particulars. Because Moshe was in a category of his own. Only Moshe had the talent, the constitution, to be able to combine prophet and sage in one, the faculty of imagination and the analytical faculty in one. After Moshe, it became split. We had those who were prophets and those who were sages, the right brain and the left brain, but it was split. Now Rav Kook goes on, and he quotes from the Talmud, right, that the sage is superior to a prophet. That which prophecy did not accomplish with its fiery arsenal. The prophetic language is moving, it's fiery, it's passionate, but it's failed. That which prophecy did not accomplish with its fire arsenal, namely to purge Israel of idolatry and to uproot the worst degradations of oppression, violence, and robbery, murder, sexual corruption, and the pursuit of bribes, the sages were able to accomplish through the expansion of Torah, by raising up many students, and by constant review of particular laws and their applications, as we find in this midrashic interpretation of the verse in Habakkuk, the eternal paths lead to him, right? Shouldn't be read halichot, right? The eternal paths. Paths are wide, highway leading to him. No, not halichot paths, but halachot, law. That ultimately to create a God-fearing, orderly, holy society, we need not halichot, the broad paths of the poetic imagination, prophecy, but halachot, the details of the halachic system, which has the power to regulate us, to transform us. Rav Kook goes on. Something went wrong again. In the course of time, the work of the sages superseded the work of the prophets, and prophecy ceased altogether. Once it was clear that the prophetic endeavor failed, generalities ultimately cannot transform. Only those who engage in the details of the law can ultimately transform society. And then that became the dominant expression of Jewish life, that of Talmudic Judaism. Prophecy ceased. It became irrelevant. A long time having passed, the generalities began to wane. The ability to think poetically in big terms, in lyrical terms, in poetic terms, waned. They were swallowed up in details and disappeared from sight. We have Rabbinic Judaism, a Judaism which thinks in terms of halachic particulars, and the lyrical imagination became irrelevant. But that's actually a problem also. Rav Kook now suggests, as we approach the period of ultimate redemption, prophecy will again become revived. The faculty of imagination will be resurrected. The poetic voice, the lyrical flourish, the artistic imagination applied to the realm of the holy. Let's read. Therefore, at the end of days, when the light of prophecy will revive, as it is written, he quotes from the prophet Yoel, I shall pour out my spirit on all flesh. And the verse continues, your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Right? There will be a renewal of prophecy at the end of days. Then the loathing of particulars will abound. This is an extremely important sentence. Rav Kook says, as we start to approach the Messianic era, then the faculty of imagination, which ultimately is the infrastructure upon which prophecy is built, will start to become regenerated, and there will be a loathing of particulars. Right? He explained before that the poetic imagination doesn't appreciate details. It doesn't appreciate the power of law, of legalistic thinking, of analytical thinking. And as the Jewish people therefore approach this period of the revival of the faculty of imagination and prophecy, ultimately, people rebel against the halachic system. Rav Kook is trying to explain, how do we understand the mass alienation of Jewish people towards Rabbinic Judaism? What happened starting in the 19th century, perhaps even 18th century, until now? Why is it that most Jews are alienated from Rabbinic Judaism? Why is it that the founders of the state of Israel, we have to be honest, were those who were rebelling against Rabbinic Judaism, although they had grand ideas, noble ideas, huge ideas, because the two are connected, Rav Kook claims, that it's very hard for these two faculties to exist. And when the faculty of imagination, the revival of the first flowering of prophecy starts to bud within the Jewish people, there's going to be a natural feeling of alienation from the approach of details, of analytical thinking, of the halachic, Talmudic mentality. And he quotes the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin, Perek to describe this. The Talmud says that, you know what it's going to be like when the Messiah comes? And it describes really terrible things. The wisdom of scribes will decay. Those who live on the boundary will wander from city to city, finding no favor. That's what it says in the Talmud there. So Rav Kook says, what it means the wisdom of sages will decay. It means that when you have a system that focuses on particulars, but the generality, the big ideas have become lost. The whys. Why do we do these things? What's the big ideas? What's the spiritual concept that underlies the halachic system? Over time, that became invisible because we became fully involved in details, in analytical thinking, not in the poetic thinking, the power of imagination. And therefore, once the power of imagination starts to express itself, there's a thirst for the big ideas again. But where are they? Where are those big ideas behind the halachic system? And he interprets the passage that says the wisdom of scribes will decay, right? That the system of the halachic system will start to feel dry. Details with no big ideas, with no soul. A body with no soul. And those who live on the boundary, Rav Kook says that's a reference to the sages who are always making distinctions. That's what the analytical thinking is, making distinctions. That will find no favor. He's describing the alienation from halachic Judaism in his day and what brought it about. It was going in the opposite direction. Just as prophecy, when it ignored analytical legal thinking, became bankrupt, it could not make real change. It could not ultimately get rid of idolatry, murder, etc. So too, halachic thinking, when it's completely divorced from the power of imagination, from the poetic soul, ultimately becomes dry. And there'll be rebellion against that. Rav Kook goes on. Finally, the sparks of emerging prophetic light will be revealed. As we get closer to the Messianic era, the prophetic capacity, power of imagination is going to flourish and ultimately reach maturity, not as unripe fruit, which rebels against the halachic system, but as first fruits, filled with vitality and life, a prophecy which will recognize in general the greatness of the workings of wisdom, of chokhmah, and with true humility, the imaginative faculty, the prophetic faculty will exclaim, a sage is superior to a prophet. That there will be a mutual recognition of these two aspects, the halachic analytical mind and the prophetic imaginative mind will recognize the great strengths of each other. One is the body, one is the soul. One is the generalities, one is the particulars. One moves the heart and one moves behavior. And instead of the alienation and polarization which took place, which ultimately ended prophecy and endangered the halachic system ultimately too, there will be a reciprocity of appreciation. And Rav Kook ends his essay in this poetic fashion, quoting psukim from Tehillim, from Psalms. Kindness and truth meet, these polar opposites. Justice and peace kiss. Truth will sprout from the earth while justice looks down from heaven. The Lord also will bestow his bounty, and our land will yield once again its produce. And the soul of Moshe shall again appear in the world. That's not from Psalms, obviously. Moshe, which was the integration of the power of imagination, the prophetic capability, and analytical thinking, that of being a lawyer of Torah, the halachic system, the rabbinic mind, the Talmudic mind, will become merged again, integrated within the Jewish people, just like they existed in Moshe. And the soul of Moshe shall appear again in the world. Just want to end with a couple of final quick remarks. Rav Kook feels that the first buds of prophecy are starting to emerge in the Jewish people, together with the return to Zion. But it's distorted, right? Because it's resulting in a rebellion against the halachic system. Did Rav Kook think he himself was experiencing prophecy? I want to read to you a quote from Rav Kook. And I am attentive, and I listen from the depths of my heart, Rav Kook says. From the feelings of my heart, the voice of Hashem calls. And I'm terrified with a great fear. Have I descended as such that I will become a false prophet? To say Hashem sent me and the word of Hashem has not appeared to me? Rav Kook feels that there's a voice, a prophetic voice within him, which he is channeling. But then the other side of his brain says, oh my gosh, this is scary. The rabbi part of Rav Kook, not the prophet part of Rav Kook. And maybe I'm a false prophet. I'm imagining that this prophetic voice is speaking within me. And he continues, and I listen to the voice of my soul stirring. The sprouts of prophecy are growing, and the children of prophets are arising. The spirit of prophecy is traveling in the land, searching for itself a refuge, seeking mighty ones. Rav Kook is saying that with the return of the Jewish people to Zion, that together with that, in fact, the children of prophets will again become prophets, but in a way that is the aspaklaria habe'ira, the prophecy of Moshe, which combines the rabbinic mind and the prophetic soul together in integration, that realizes that we need to invigorate the heart through lyrical expression and lyrical vision. We need to motivate the body to act properly through the analytical mind, the ability to think in detail. One last sentence. Some have pointed out that the renewed interest in yeshivot, to include machshevet Yisrael, philosophy, spirituality, the great interest outside of Hasidic circles, in Hasidut, in Kabbalah, in Rav Kook. You know, in traditional yeshivot, the curriculum of the yeshivot was Talmud in the morning, Talmud in the afternoon, Talmud in the evening, the rabbinic mind, analytical thinking. Especially in the yeshivot Hester, and even in the Haredi yeshivot, people are sneaking in the Maharal, the Ramchal. Not about Rav Kook yet in the Haredi yeshivot, maybe secretly. And perhaps that's a reflection, according to Rav Kook's theoretical structure she's laid out so beautifully here, that we're reaching the period of this renewed interest into the spiritual vision, that in fact, we are reaching that point of the full flowering of prophecy, but in the spirit of Moshe, of the integration of the imaginative faculty, together with the analytical faculty. Thank you for joining me today, and we look forward to No Tisha B'Av next year.
Thank you, Rabbi Zeff. Thank you. Arthur has you recorded as well, so you'll speak to him later.